The name on the duty roster read Sergeant First Class Lena Pryce, and the room went quiet the moment the S3 called it out. Not the kind of quiet that means respect. The other kind. Captain Doyle set down his coffee mug without drinking from it. Lieutenant Harmon glanced sideways at Master Sergeant Byrd like he was waiting for someone to say something was wrong. Byrd didn't say anything. He just looked at the whiteboard, then back at the roster, then at the floor. Pryce sat in the third row and did not move. She had learned a long time ago that the best response to that particular silence was no response at all. Not a shift in the chair, not a tightening of the jaw. She had been in the Army for 11 years. She knew how rooms felt when they decided they didn't want her in them. Doyle cleared his throat. "We'll run through assignments after the brief," he said, and kept going. She wrote nothing in her notebook for the next 40 minutes. She didn't need to. She had already memorized the terrain grid, the exfil routes, the ROE, the call signs. She had been studying this particular stretch of the Kunar Valley for 6 weeks before anyone else in the room even knew the mission existed. That was what she did. That was what she had always done. It didn't matter. Most of the time, it didn't matter at all. Pryce had grown up outside of Amarillo, in a place where the land was flat enough that you could see weather coming from 20 miles out. Her father ran a feed operation and hunted whitetail every November without much ceremony. The first time he handed her a rifle, she was 9 years old. He didn't make a thing of it. He just showed her how to check the chamber, how to hold the stock against her shoulder, how to exhale before the trigger. Then he walked away and let her figure out the rest. She was a better shot than her 2 older brothers by the time she was 12. Her brothers were not gracious about it. Neither was most of the rest of her life. So in that way, it was good preparation. She enlisted at 19 after 2 semesters at a community college in Lubbock that she paid for herself because her father thought it was unnecessary. She scored high enough on the ASVAB to get almost any MOS she wanted. She chose 11B infantry because everyone told her she couldn't. She later added the sniper qualification course to her record. She finished second in her class. The soldier who finished first told her afterward that it had been close, which she appreciated, and that she was a natural, which she already knew. None of that history was in the room when Captain Doyle read her name off the roster. What was in the room was 12 years of other people's assumptions, and Doyle's coffee mug, and the sideways look that Harmon had given Byrd and not quite given back. The mission was a reconnaissance element, 4 personnel, 7-day hold in the Kunar Highlands. The tasking had originated from a request by a special operations unit that needed eyes on a supply corridor the Taliban had been using to move materiel from Pakistan. The valley was narrow. The terrain was brutal. The shot distances, if it came to that, would be extreme. Pryce had been selected because she was the most qualified long-range shooter in the brigade. That was a fact. It was documented. It was not, apparently, sufficient. 3 days before the operation, Byrd called her into the hallway outside the TOC. "I want to have a direct conversation with you," he said. "Go ahead, Sergeant Major. Doyle's going to keep you on the manifest. You should know that. But I want you to understand that some of the senior guys have concerns." She waited. "Not about your shooting," he said. "Your record's solid. Nobody's questioning your score. What are they questioning?" Byrd looked at the wall behind her. "Whether the team dynamic works. Whether having a female in that particular element creates complications. Access to facilities in austere environments. Team cohesion under. I've operated in austere environments for 11 years, she said. So I have a lot of women. The Army figured out the facilities question some time ago. I know that. Do you need me to explain how? No, he said. I'm just telling you what the conversation has been. She nodded. She thanked him for the directness. She walked back into the TOC and returned to the map she had been studying. And she did not think about Byrd or the conversation again for the rest of the day. There was no value in thinking about it. The mission hadn't changed. The terrain hadn't changed. Her qualifications hadn't changed. The only things that changed when she walked into rooms were the rooms themselves, and rooms were not her problem. The team was 4. Pryce, a sergeant named Fitch who ran communications, a staff sergeant named Aldrin who was the element leader, and a captain named Solis from the attached SF detachment who had been on this ground before and spoke Pashto well enough to be useful. Aldrin was professional and quiet and gave her nothing to work with one way or the other, which she respected. Fitch was friendly in the performative way of someone trying to signal that he was not the kind of person who had a problem with anything, which she found mildly exhausting, but harmless. Solis she couldn't read yet. and she had learned not to try until she'd seen a person in the field. They inserted at 0330 from a fire base 60 kilometers west, riding in 2 Hilux trucks with Afghan National Army markings, switching to foot movement at a shepherd's track where the road ended and the mountain began. The elevation gain in the first 2 hours was over 1,000 feet. Nobody talked. The gear was heavy. The sky was the particular dark that exists just before it starts to think about becoming light. Pryce moved well in the mountains. She always had. She had a low center of gravity, and she had spent enough time at altitude that her body understood what to do with thin air. She set her own pace and let the terrain dictate her breathing and watched the ground in front of her feet and the ridgeline above her simultaneously, which was not something most people could do without training and practice. She had both. By the time they reached the hide site at 061, the valley below was becoming visible. The corridor they'd been tasked to observe ran for roughly 4 kilometers along the valley floor, threading between 2 dry riverbeds that turned white in spring and were dust in October. There was a village at the southern end. There was nothing at the northern end except rock and altitude. Aldrin set the observation schedule. Pryce took the first 4-hour block because she wanted to establish the range cards before anyone else touched the position. She built them methodically, ranging every significant terrain feature, calculating come-ups for the distances she'd be working, noting the wind patterns in the valley, which were complicated by the way the rock walls channeled airflow into something that had no clean name. Fitch watched her work for a while and then said, "That's a lot of math." "Yes," she said. "You do all that in your head?" "Some of it," she said. "The rest I write down so I don't have to." He nodded and went back to his comms check. She went back to her range cards. On the 3rd day, she saw something wrong. It was subtle. The valley had a rhythm to it, the way inhabited places always do. The same tea cellar opening at the same hour, the same cluster of men near the mosque after midday prayer, the same foot traffic patterns that mapped themselves onto the same geography every day until they became predictable as tides. Pryce had been watching long enough that the rhythm was in her body now, automatic, which was how she noticed when it changed. The tea cellar didn't open. Not unusual by itself. Illness, family matter, any number of reasons. But 2 hours later, the midday cluster near the mosque was smaller than it had been on each of the previous 3 days. And the men who remained were standing differently. Not the loose, easy posture of men who had finished prayer and had nowhere to be, but something tighter, something oriented. She couldn't have said in words exactly what the difference was. She just felt it, the way you feel a room that's about to change before anything has moved. She flagged Solis and showed him the spotting scope. "Tell me what you see," she said. He looked for a long time. Fewer people at the mosque. "But look at the road between the southern compound and the dry channel." He adjusted, looked again. Vehicle staging," he said quietly. 3 motorcycles this morning. Now there are 7, and the door on that compound has been open since 0800. It's been closed at this hour every other day. Solis handed the scope back. He was already reaching for the radio. The intelligence report they submitted was not acted on immediately. This was not unusual. Intelligence at that level moved through channels that had their own timelines. Aldrin sent it up, confirmed receipt, and they went back to observing. Pryce understood that this was how it worked. She didn't waste energy on frustration. She watched the valley. What she had not put in the report, because she had no way to confirm it yet, was her read on timing. The staging she'd seen felt like something that was almost ready, not something that was in motion. 12 hours, maybe less, which meant the report needed to move faster than reports usually moved. She told Aldrin this. He listened. He said he'd send a follow-up with a time sensitivity flag. She said thank you and went back to her scope. The follow-up got lost somewhere between the fire base and the brigade TOC. She found this out later. At the time, what she knew was that the acknowledgement took 4 hours, which was too long, and by the time it came back, the staging she'd observed had evolved into something else. The motorcycles had left. The compound door was closed. For 2 hours, the valley looked exactly as it had looked on the first day, and she wondered whether she'd been wrong. Not about what she'd seen. She was certain about what she'd seen, but about what it meant. Then the firing started. It came from the ridgeline to the northeast, which meant the element that had been staging in the valley had moved during the period she'd been watching the road. They had used the dry channel as cover. They had come up the back slope of the ridge where there was no line of sight from the hide site, and they had positioned themselves on the high ground above a patrol that was now caught in the open on a traversing trail 600 meters below. She recognized the patrol's call sign from the radio traffic. It was a 12-man unit out of 2nd Battalion. They had a route that took them along that trail twice a week. The ambush was well constructed. The firing positions covered the eastern approach and the western withdrawal simultaneously. The patrol was pinned. She heard the element leader's voice on the radio, controlled but tight, reporting contact and requesting support. She was already on the scope. The primary firing position was at 1,410 meters. She had a range card for it. She made 2 adjustments and held. The shot was not the problem. The math was not the problem. The problem was that the firing position was occupied by at least 3 individuals, and she had a single rifle with a single bolt action and needed to think about sequencing before she thought about anything else. She thought about it for approximately 4 seconds. First shot, the position with the best angle of suppression on the patrol. Second shot, the position with the communications equipment she could see through the scope. Third shot, the position that could most easily relocate and maintain the ambush. She was already building the firing solution for the third before the second was finished. The engagement lasted 9 minutes. By the end of it, the ambush had collapsed. The patrol was moving. She had fired 7 rounds from 3 positions, relocating after each cluster, and she was breathing hard from the movement and from nothing else. Solis was on the radio. Fitch was already breaking down the comm equipment. Aldrin was beside her, and he wasn't saying anything, which was the right thing to be doing, and she appreciated it. Later, after they were off the mountain and back at the fire base, and she had eaten something and slept for 3 hours, she sat with Solis in the back corner of the operations cell, and he told her what the patrol leader had said on the net. 12 personnel, all accounted for. The ambush element had withdrawn before they could be positively identified. They had found blood on the rocks at one of the firing positions but no body, which told her she had hit but not confirmed. And in the scheme of things, that was fine. She hadn't been trying to make it clean. She had been trying to make it stop. Solis had a quiet way of acknowledging things without making them into a ceremony. He just nodded once and said, "Good shooting," and went back to his report. She found that she liked him. She found out about the debrief from Fitch, who found out about it from his counterpart in the T. It was held the day after they returned, in a conference room at the fire base, and her name was not on the attendance list. She went anyway. The room contained the firebase commander, a colonel named Wexler, and several staff officers, and the intelligence officer who had been responsible for the section where her report had been delayed. Aldrin was there, Solis was there. She sat down between them. Wexler looked at her, and then looked at the attendance list, and then looked at her again. "Sergeant First Class Pryce," he said. "Sir," she said. "Do you have something to contribute?" "Yes, sir," she said. "I'm the one who filed the initial observation report." There was a pause. The intelligence officer across the table, a major named Cheswick, straightened slightly in his chair. "That report," Wexler said, "is part of what we're reviewing today. I'm aware of that, sir. The delay in processing that report is also part of what we're reviewing." "Yes, sir." He held her eye for a moment and she held it back, and then he said, "All right," and looked down at the notes in front of him, and the debrief continued. She said what she needed to say and kept it precise and did not editorialize. She described what she had observed, in what sequence, with what reasoning. She described the follow-up she had requested and the timeline of acknowledgement. She described the engagement itself, the round count, the relocation sequence. She answered the questions she was asked and did not answer the ones she wasn't. Cheswick said very little. After the debrief, he gathered his materials quickly and left the room before most people had stood up. She watched him go and thought about what that meant and decided it didn't matter. What mattered was what Wexler said to Aldrin before they all dispersed. "Get me her service record this afternoon," Wexler said. "The complete file." Aldrin said, "Yes, sir," and glanced sideways at her with an expression she couldn't quite read, and she thought about it for a moment and then put it down and stopped thinking about it. She had no control over what happened in rooms she wasn't in. She never had. 3 weeks later, the paperwork arrived. It was not a large ceremony. It was not supposed to be. She had specifically said she didn't want one. Wexler came anyway, along with Aldrin and Solis and Fitch and a handful of others whose presence she had not requested but did not object to. Wexler read the citation without elaboration. She stood in the way she had been standing in formations for 11 years, without effect, looking at the middle distance, the way soldiers look when they are waiting for something to be finished. The decoration was a bronze star with Valor device. Wexler shook her hand afterward. He said, "The army should have been doing this sooner." She wasn't entirely sure what he meant, sooner in the sequence of events or something larger than that, but she said thank you and meant it and left it there. Aldrin stayed after. He handed her a cup of coffee, which she accepted. Cheswick put in a formal objection, he said, to the recommendation. She hadn't known that, but it didn't surprise her. "On what grounds?" Said the delay in response to your initial report was procedural, not actionable, and that the engagement decision during the ambush exceeded your authorized. The engagement was within row, Wexler agreed. Objection was denied. He looked at the metal box, which she was holding at her side. "You could have made more noise when the report was delayed." "It wouldn't have moved it faster," she said. "Maybe not. Noise doesn't move things faster in this organization. Knowing who to call moves things faster." She paused. "I didn't know who to call. I'll know next time." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "For what it's worth, I was wrong about you." She looked at him. "Before the mission," he said, "I had reservations. You were briefed on some of them." "Some," she said. "I was wrong." She thought about what to say, not about whether to accept it. She had decided before he finished speaking that she would, because it had cost him something to say it, and the cost was visible, and she respected that. She just thought about the right words. "It happens," she said finally. He nodded once. They finished their coffee. Outside the firebase, the mountains sat the way they always sat, still and massive and entirely indifferent to everything that had happened in their shadow. And she stood for a moment looking at them before she went back inside to finish her after-action report. She always finished the paperwork. That was the other thing she did, besides the math. She made sure everything was documented, every observation, every decision, every round, in language that was precise and permanent, not because anyone was going to read it, because someday someone would.